Hello. Okay. Thanks for coming in quickly after the book talk. I'm sorry, the coffee break. Book talk. It's in my head. I have a book talk after this. It's in my head. So let me just briefly introduce our participant for this session. Jihan Mohammed is a PhD student at Michigan State University's Department of Sociology, and she's going to be presenting a paper today about sectarianism in Iraq, and it's kind of like a research proposal. So your comments are at a very good time and would be very valued. So I'm just going to give her, if we're starting at 10:20, I'll give you 20 to 30 minutes. 30 minutes? Okay. Well, anyway, I'll give you little hints that you're almost up of time, and then we'll open it up to discussing comments.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending this session. As Dana mentioned, this is a research proposal, so for me, this is actually a perfect time to receive feedback to improve this proposal before moving on and fully working on it. So I'm gonna consider you as my committee, my PhD committee, so any comments, contributions, concerns are very, very welcomed. And today my research is on measuring sectarian discrimination on an individual level in Iraq, and specifically between Iraqi Sunnis and Iraqi Shias. Out of necessity, in the proposal, I give a brief historical introduction, and that's because oftentimes the reader is not familiar very well with the Middle Eastern context or the Iraqi context. So in the paper, I start this I give this historical background from the Ottoman Empire and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and how the post-Ottoman Empire was a period in which sectarian identity started being formulated and increasingly contested over access to political power. I know Toby, in his lecture, he tried to push this narrative, and he was arguing that these sectarian tensions in the region actually date back to the 16th century. So Nate, you're a historian. For me, this is still like a gray area. I need to dig better into the history and see what exactly happened back then, and look at these two arguments. Those who argue that specifically in Iraq, these identities were formulated in the post-Ottoman Empire, versus Toby and others who argue otherwise. And in this brief introduction, I also talk about how Shias throughout the 20th centuries were perceived as reluctant Iraqis due to their fight against the Ottoman, the British, and later on against the Iraqi state and some of the discriminatory laws that were passed, such as the Nationality Law of 1924. And then I move on to a more recent history of the American invasion of 2003, and how this period was characterized by the rise of terrorism and the rise of Shia militias and Sunni militias in Iraq. And then I move on to the most recent significant event in Iraq and the occupation of ISIS of some key Iraqi cities. So the argument that I'm trying to make here is that throughout the 20th century and early 21st century, these events that unfolded in Iraq arguably aggravated relations among ethnic and sectarian relations inside Iraq. I have three specific research questions that I'm trying to answer. The first one, I am trying to find out whether or not Iraqi Sunnis and Iraqi Shias discriminate against each other. And this because among Iraqis and Iraqi scholars, I feel like there's this dichotomous argument, and the first group that argues that sectarianism is not actually a thing in Iraq, and all Iraqis are brothers and sisters, and there is no sectarianism in Iraq. And the other bloc actually looks at Iraq exclusively in sectarian terms, and argues that sectarianism exists in Iraq, and we should look into it. So I'm trying to answer these questions. Do they discriminate against each other? No. If yes, to what extent? The second, my second research question, I am trying to look at the this variable, which is the frequency of following political news and following political news from sect-affiliated and sectarian-affiliated media, and the impact of this variable on sectarian discrimination. My third research question has a few variables, so I'm trying to look at the impact of these three variables on sectarian discriminations, and the variables are the person's degree of religiosity, the person's self-identification with a sectarian group, and finally, the direct and the indirect impact of violence unfolded after 2003. The literature. We talked a lot in the past few days about the literature, and this was a very lonely journey for me to navigate in the literature, given the fact that my institution and also my committee do not work on sectarianism, and with Olivia we talked how difficult it could be to navigate and to find, to find references, I guess. Anyhow, so in this paper, I talked about what we have published so far and what is the approach that scholars take to analyze sectarianism in the Middle East. There are these three schools of thoughts that scholars often use to make sense of sectarianism, and we, I think, extensively talked about this during this winter school. The primordial model, the instrumentalist model, and the constructivist model. I don't want to sound redundant. I'm not going to go and talk about them each. So in this proposal, I briefly talk about these three schools of thought and how there is an ongoing debate among scholars what is the best model, or a combination of which models is best to explain sectarianism, and this debate is ongoing. I'm not trying to settle this debate because, to be honest, it's not. Yeah, and I don't think you can do that in one paper. It's much more complex than that. And I think Morten did a great job talking about this, and he proposed to move beyond constructivism, which an argument I do subscribe to. I'm actually closer to the argument of constructivists and not primordialists. However, I do not think that constructivists provide me all the answers. There are still, things that aren't clear, and this model does not explain a few things to me. So, and Morten proposed these three strategies to find for a savior, a new theory, a new school of thought that gives all the answers, to solve this issue, or to use the baby in the bath water, I think that's what he called. And it's the idea to actually use these three schools of thought as far as they help us answer our research questions. And when we reach the point that they don't, we need to look for answers elsewhere and perhaps use the Lego strategy. And I think in this research, I'm trying to use the Lego strategy, and it's the idea you're building this project and a piece or a part is missing, so you're trying to bring in theories from other disciplines and, to complete this project. And I will talk how I am bringing in the literature on discrimination and prejudice to, to build this Lego project. With that being said, where is my position in all this? My position is we do need to, constructivism isn't the answer to all the research questions, and for me, it provides a lot of answers, but not all of the answers. And I'm still in my research, I'm still trying to find answers in other disciplines. However, I agree on these three main arguments that all scholars agree on. And the first argument is that Middle Easterners have multiple identities, and the nationalist, religious, ethnic, and to an extent the linguistic identity are important for Middle Easterners. The second argument that I subscribe to is, and this is really important, that these identities aren't fixed. They change over time, and they're flexible. The third argument that I'm making in this proposal is that we have three levels of powers, the national level, the regional, and the international powers that do impact on how ethnic and sectarian identities are mobilized or demobilized. What is the gap that I found in the literature? The gap that I found specifically in the Western literature published in English, I'm arguing that it takes an exclusive macro perspective to the issue of sectarianism, and it heavily focuses on the role of elites and the state and religious clerics in mobilizing ethnic and sectarian identities. So the gap is, where is the macro level analysis of all this, which I think it's very important. The second gap that I found is there is a lack of discussion, and so there is a discussion, but it's not, there isn't enough discussion on other forms of sectarianism, because I don't think sectarianism is manifested exclusively aggressively and violently. No, sectarianism could be manifested in other forms, such as stereotype, discrimination, prejudice, and here I'm wearing my sociological hat. And the argument that I'm making is that from the bottom up, sectarianism is reproduced through our everyday social interactions. This line of thought, correct me if I'm wrong, is inspired by the work of Juana Randonoko. I hope I'm saying her name correctly, and her work done in Lebanon. And she's again looking at this bottom-up process, and she's looking at the infrastructure, how the interaction between ordinary people is helps reproducing these identities, these dichotomies. And building on his argument, there are research coming out from Europe for some reason, which is really fascinating, especially the work of Fibiger. Yeah, I know Anna Christine knows him, and I hope I can meet him one day. He did an ethnographic work in Bahrain and Kuwait, and he's also looking at how social interactions contribute to the mobilization of sectarian identity. So my research tries to build on this line of argument, if I make sense. And it's the idea that not only politicians and elites and state mobilize identities, but ordinary people they contribute to that as well. So, I think I just explained that. What do we mean by sectarianism on the individual level, or what Juana Noko calls everyday sectarianism? It's the idea that elites, yes, they mobilize these identities, and they may use mass media, education, social media, and other venues to spread sectarian hatred. The members of family, friends, do have their own contribution to the reproduction of sectarian discrimination, hatred, or stereotype. I'm not sure, I don't see my slides there. I think I'm gonna open them from here. So the work of Fibiger, No-Show, and other papers coming out from Lebanon, they argue that even at school, at state institutions, and in barber shops, in markets, you do hear topics on sectarianism that hold, sectarian stereotype and prejudice. The Lego piece that I'm bringing in is from prejudice and discrimination literature. And discrimination is defined in this literature as the unequal treatment of a person who belongs to a different group, be that a racial group, an ethnic group, or a sectarian group. And discrimination manifests at different levels and in different forms. It could be on an individual level, or it could be at meso or a micro level. And it could be overt, like blatant and obvious, or it could be covert and subtle and indirect. And this second version of discrimination is referred to as microaggression. It's the brief or long verbal, nonverbal exchanges between humans. It's indirect, yet it holds derogatory messages, and scholars using quantitative studies, they have, it's harder to measure this form of discrimination versus the overt and the direct form of discrimination. So what is my synthesis? My synthesis is sectarian discrimination. So I came up with this new concept, and I operationalize this variable as the unequal treatment of a person who belongs to a different sect. And it could be manifested, sectarian discrimination could be manifested at different levels, as the literature on sectarianism argues, and it could be direct or indirect. Data and method. I'm using mixed methods for this project. The first method is a secondary data analysis, and here I'm using the Eurobarometer data set. I came to the school, having this package with me, but I'm already in discussion with my advisor to replace this data set. But I'm gonna present I will do this presentation talking about the Eurobarometer data set. So I'm using the second wave. It was collected in 2011, and various Iraqi provinces were surveyed. And as far as statistical tools that I will use, I'm using SEM to test my hypotheses and the software's data. To address the limitations in this in the Eurobarometer data set, I will do semi-structured interviews with Iraqis, specifically from the city of Mosul. I'm debating where to do these interviews given the political development of the past week. These interviews will take place by the end of January, and between end of January and end of February. So what is my dependent variable? My dependent variable is sectarian discrimination, and from the Eurobarometer data set, I'm using these 3 questions that were asked to Iraqis in 2011. I'm gonna read the questions and you can look at their measurements. The first question is, Iraqis were asked that religious and denominational differences shouldn't be a reason for doubting the patriotism of any individual. The second question is, to what extent belonging to a different religion or denomination an obstacle to accepting your son, daughter, sister, brother's marriage? And the third question, would you mind having members of a different religious sect as your neighbor? My independent variables, and I'm moving to my second research question. And if you remember, I'm trying to measure the impact of the frequency of following political news from sect-affiliated and partisan-affiliated resources, and how that is associated with sectarian discrimination. So, for this variable, I'm using these questions. A series of questions were asked to Iraqis about their religious, about the source they used to follow political news. And Iraqis identified over 40 sources. I will drop magazine, websites, and newspapers, and I'm keeping only television and radio station. And I'm also using a second question. They were asked about the frequency of following political news, do you follow political news in your country? And people answered to a great extent, a medium extent, a limited extent, or I don't know. For the religiosity, a very interesting construct in sociology, and in the paper I do talk about the literature review. I don't have time to talk about it during this presentation. I will be happy to answer questions during the Q&A. How I'm going to measure this variable, I will use a few questions from the Eurobarometer data set. The first set of questions are about religious rituals. People were asked if they pray daily, if they go to the mosque, if they listen to religious, if they read religious books, and so on and so forth. And the second question is whether or not people consider themselves religious or not. So I'm combining all these questions, and I'm creating a latent variable called religiosity. Sectarian self-identification, yet another independent variable, and using the secondary data analysis method, I know there are a lot of limitations with this measurement, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So in the Eurobarometer data set, people were asked this question: if I ask about your religion, would you prefer the answer to be Sunni Muslim, Shia Muslim, or just Muslim? And I'm arguing that there are limitations, that this is this isn't enough to measure self-identification with a sectarian group. So how I'm going to fix that, during my semi-structured interviews, I prepared questions. These are 2 of the questions. I have more. I will ask, do you regard yourself as belonging to any particular religious sect? And this is just to bring this data up to date, because Iraqis were asked in 2011, and I want to know your opinion, their opinion today. The second question, I want to give them, more options to choose from. And for example, I'm asking if they consider themselves as Iraqi or a Muslim or a Sunni. And I have other questions in my appendix. If you, I'll be happy to answer questions during the Q&A about this measurement. For the direct and the indirect impact of violence, the Eurobarometer data set does not provide a lot of questions. I couldn't find anything that can help me measure this variable, so I'm going to rely on semi-structured interviews, and I prepared these questions. These are some of the questions that I have for them. I'm going to ask if whether or not in any way the civil war of 2005 and 2007 impacted on their life, and the same question about the impact of ISIS, control of ISIS, and the liberation of Mosul, and whether or not that impacted on their life. Yes, I don't want to read from the slides. I'm just going to move to the next one. And of course, I have some control variables in my model, such as age, gender, education, urban versus rural. These are I have 4 main hypotheses. The first one is I do expect a positive relationship between sectarian discrimination and the frequency of following political news from partisan and sect-affiliated news. More importantly, I expect a not significant relationship between religiosity and sectarian discrimination. As far as self-identification with a sectarian sect, I do expect to find a positive association between this variable and the dependent variable. And finally, I also expect a positive association between sectarian discrimination and the direct and the indirect impact of violence. And basically, a person who is impacted more by these conflicts is more likely to discriminate based on sect versus someone who was not impacted by these conflicts. This is not my favorite slide because 5 minutes? Yeah, I'm almost done. These are a few limitations in my research. So, for example, this data set is not the best data set out there to use to test my hypotheses, and I came to this winter school, and they let me know that I can have free access to the Arab Opinion Index, which is a great news for me. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, so much. And I'm already looking at their survey. I actually looked at their 2017 wave, 2016 and 15 wave. And in the 2017 wave, I think they do a great job measuring sectarian discrimination. They have many questions. So I'm already in discuss. I already talked with my advisor to replace the Eurobarometer data set with the Arab Opinion Index, because Arab Opinion Index is way more helpful. And again, the 3 items used to measure sectarian discrimination, my dependent variable, this is very limited. 3 questions aren't enough to measure sectarian discrimination, but as I just mentioned, I'm going to replace this data set. In the paper, in the proposal, I just realized that I talk about covert discrimination and that I'm gonna measure that, but at the end of the paper, I realized I do not talk about it. I do not talk how I'm gonna measure it, so that's another limitation in the paper draft. If you think there are other limitations, please let me know. And because again, this is a proposal and I'm trying to improve it. And that's it.
Thank you, Jihan, for that presentation. So I'm just it's gonna be a little bit what is the word? Running thoughts.
Yes.
So, also my English is failing me this morning. So I would say, first with the framing of the proposal, I'm not really sure what, I understand it's a proposal, you're going to submit this to a committee, but I presume that at some point you want to turn this into a job market paper. So the way that it's written kind of is in kind of a straw man way. So the question seems framed in a very obvious way. Like, do Sunnis and Shiites discriminate against each other? Well, they take arms against each other, so I think that they do discriminate. Or at least that would be the very obvious response to you. I think it would be better to frame the theoretical contribution as either how prejudice manifests itself or the causality of sectarianism. It's not just institutions to people, but people up to the whole bottom-up thing. So just the way that you frame the research questions needs to just be a little bit changed. And in terms of if you decide to go the route of one of your theoretical contributions being how prejudice manifests itself in real life, there's a lot of work in American politics on this, on racial prejudice, but I think that it travels. So in my own work, I look at polarization in the American context and use it to inform how I understand polarization in the Middle East. So I think that could be an option for you. And then there's also this, kind of intervention in the proposal about how you want to talk about the media also. So that would be maybe a slightly different theoretical contribution. You could go that route too, but that is in and of itself its own kind of contribution that doesn't seem to mesh with the rest. But if you want to focus on how media plays kind of a sectarianizing role, again, that would be fine. You just need to kind of straightforwardly make it the main dependent variable. And again, I think American politics can contribute here about the impact of media, especially Zoller's work at UCLA. In the sense that if you wanted to turn this into a paper that you could present at a conference or submit to a job talk or something, the background portion, I understand you're trying to give a background for people who are not very familiar, but it has too long of a scope. It goes too far into history and kind of makes too many simplifications. I think that you could frame it post 2003 and you can talk about it that way. So in the theoretical portion, I know that you cite Dr. Azmi's, I guess it's the introduction of his book that was published at the Muntaqa, but I would urge you to read the book overall and look at his explanations for the underpinnings of sectarianism. And then there are some of your variables that I can kind of have an inclination of how you think it has to do with the main question, but it's not fully stated. So you go into measurement, and then the religiosity section kind of comes out of the blue when you're discussing measurement. So the link between religiosity and sectarianism should come earlier in your theoretical argument. And why is that kind of a major, or you think it's some sort of major connection? Now, in terms of measurement, I heard you say in some, one of the last slides about how you've been looking at the Arab Opinion Index. There's stuff on ISIS, impact of violence. There's stuff on sectarianism. So maybe we'll talk about that, individually. But also, overall, some of the ways that you're measuring sectarianism, whether you use the Arab Barometer or the Arab Opinion Index, I would obviously say Arab Opinion Index is stronger, but the sectarian self-identification question, I think, can sometimes be a bit of a stretch. There's obviously going to be responder bias here, depending on a lot of things, how educated the respondent is, whether they are at the moment in a more cosmopolitan place, all of these things. So they might say, oh no, I identify as a Muslim, but really they have other identifications that are stronger to them. They just are maybe embarrassed to say, especially in let's say we do a 2020 wave after all of these protests. It might become a little bit less, more taboo to say that you're actually very sectarian. You see what I'm saying? So I think that it might be a good idea to employ experimental analysis here, employ list experiments to kind of mask sensitive questions. And we can talk about how you can how you can do that in conjunction with ongoing surveys. So are you familiar with like list experiments and stuff like that?
No, because they are popular in political science and not so much in sociology.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm aware there are, people
But
doing.
it's pretty clever, I would say.
Yes,
on
it's
how
very,
to mask
yeah.
it. So,
It's actually a very interesting methodology. Yeah.
so I would say, if you're interested in kind of borrowing from different disciplines, it would be a good way to get at how sectarian they really, or like how important their sectarian identity really is to them, while not asking it, obviously. Sorry, my computer just turned off. The last thing I wanted to say, everybody criticizes me for speaking very fast, but we can have an ongoing conversation. But the last thing I wanted to say is I think that the interviews need to be grounded a little bit more effectively. Like, as it stands, to somebody just reading this kind of for the first time, the immediate reaction is they seem a little bit limited. It's not really clear on what basis the interviewees will be chosen. What's the purpose of them even? Somebody might say, okay, well, why don't you do focus groups if you want to see the impact of violence? Or you see what I'm saying? Like, they need the interviews need to just be utilized in a more systematic way. And you're going to get a lot of pushback from people that see quant and get really nervous. They're like, you can't do this quantitatively. And then they'll be like, and this whole interview thing is a qualitative fig leaf. But like, if you systematize the interviews, you can kind of cover your bases on both fronts. I don't know if that made much sense, but those are my very quick comments. And I know that Dr. Mohammed has quite a lot of, I see you scribbling away, so I'm not sure.
Writing down your comments.
Oh, okay. Not important. So I think I'll just hand it over to Dr. Mohammed.
Do you want to
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much. This was actually very, very helpful. Yeah, sure.
I'm so sorry. I just forgot one thing. The religiosity measure,
Yes.
the combination of questions that you use, are you using it, like, are you making an index?
Yes.
Have you tried it? Have you looked at the alpha Cronbach measure?
I used it for another research, and it was, I believe, 70-something.
Okay, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
it just wasn't
It's
clear
on
from the
the edge, yeah.
proposal.
Yeah.
Okay, just a quick question.
So yes, I am aware of the methodologies coming from political science, and they are fascinating. The experiments, and I also attended some panels at Mesa conference where they access their population in these conflict areas where it's impossible to physically get there. And they're doing Facebook surveys acknowledging, the limitations. But I think that these methodologies are really, really interesting, and they're emerging from other disciplines. And again, me wearing my sociological hat, I'm trying to familiarize myself with these disciplines, but they are in my radar. Regarding the self-identification question and how Iraqis, could be biased in their answers, and I put a section in the proposal, then I removed it, and Ali Al-Wardi does a great job talking about this, how the Iraqi culture is, Iraqis aren't direct, they avoid talking about sectarian relations, and Fanat Haddad actually does a great job explaining why, because historically, yeah.
That would mean that the question you asked needs to change.
Exactly. So that is a question, and somebody might question all Iraqis' answers on all these questions, even when you ask them about whether or not they want to have a neighbor from a different sect. Iraqis are, reluctant to talk about sectarian relations, just how Americans are reluctant to talk about race.
Which is why in
Yeah.
American politics they use these
Yes.
experimental methods in a way
Yeah. And this is a great paper idea, if there is somebody who wants to co-author with me and to talk about how respondents from the Middle East, could not, their responses could be limited because of,
There's been some work on this. Justin Gengler just released a
Justin
paper in
Gengler.
the British Journal of Political Science.
Yeah.
Justin Gengler just released a paper in the British Journal of Political Science on how, like what, in terms of like Arab respondents, where the limitations are, but also where kind of the assumptions are on our end, that we think that they might be hiding more than they are. So that might be something to look at. And then Rana Khouri also released a Perspectives on Politics piece about accessing respondents in kind of hard to get populations, and how even if you do, like, your interviews kind of in a snowball sample kind of way, it might not be systematic, but there's ways to correct for it post analysis. Sorry,
Yeah.
that just came randomly.
I think that's it. Thank you so much. This was very, very helpful.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation for me. I think overall the presentation reflect a research that the homework is done. You know, the different aspects of the research is there. To which extent that I agree or I disagree with it, it's a matter of my opinion. I have to agree with Dana about your main question about the tension between the Shiite or the Sunnis, or if there is a sectarian tension of, or there is a polarization, because there is. I feel that, you know, there is a phenomenon that is constructed nowadays. I don't think that it goes back to the 20s or the 30s. It doesn't go back to the 17th or the 16th century. I disagree with this. However, it is one of the main factors that are influencing and acting in Iraq and in the region, to the extent that the people are going back to their history, reading it differently, discovering some aspects of their history they were not important for them, for example, 30 years or 40 years ago. I want so maybe, you know, maybe you need to work a little bit about your question, especially that you are using different tools that can refine the question and put it in different perspective. I wanted just to comment about the issue of discrimination, direct, written, formal, informal discrimination, which I understand, and the stereotypes, which I don't think that they influence the sectarianism in Iraq or the division within any given society in the Arab world, because there are a lot of stereotypes between different regions in any given country in the Arab world, but that does not lead to a conflict in the Arab world. I mean, how would you explain, for example, if you collect all of the jokes that the Syrians have about the Himsi or about Hims in Syria? This is maybe related, you know, to stereotypes, maybe, but it's not. It does not constitute a division within the society between Himsis and non-Himsis, or about, you know, the jokes that the Palestinians have about the people of Al-Khalil or Hebron. So I think this needs to be revisited. The other thing about discrimination, are we studying the policies, the events, that there is a discrimination against a specific group or a specific segment of the society that we are studying? Or are we studying that the people believe that there is a discrimination against them regardless if we have evidence that there is such a policy or such act? Since we are talking about surveys, let me take into consideration, for example, that the majority of the Arab people, when we ask them about, for example, the corruption in their own countries, something like 90% they say that the corruption is spread in their own countries. When we ask them, when was the last time that you were asked for a bribe, or you faced somebody who is asking you to do something which you consider as a corrupt act, the percentage goes down to it varies from one country to another, but between 30% to 60%. So there is a perception that there is corruption in their own country that reaches 90% of the people. They have consensus that, you know, that there is a corruption. But when you ask about evidence, a first-hand experience of corruption, that might go to 30%. About religion, I want to come back to the issue of marriage. I don't think that, and sometimes we use it in the Arab Opinion Index, if you accept, you know, that your sister or your daughter or to get married to somebody from a different sect or from different religion, or I'm not sure if this can be useful, because it depends on the society and it depends on the region within the society or the or the community within the. For example, if we take some specific regions in a specific society which is more conservative, people wouldn't accept this, wouldn't accept that their daughters or sisters to get married to some people outside that region, regardless the religion or the sect, or, I mean, up to the early 80s, for example, in a country like Jordan, the people prefer that their daughters and sisters get married to their cousins or within the same tribe. Getting married outside the village is a new phenomenon that we started witnessing from the mid-80s, let alone the different religion. Okay. Sometimes I feel that a question like exploring why they would not accept that their daughters or their sisters marrying to somebody from different region or from different nationality or from different religion or sect is more important, because that would explain to us to which extent that the respondents or the interviewees focusing on social pressure, or they come from or they refuse this because of religious reasons. However, I mean, if you have, I mean, you mentioned that you examined the index. Okay, the other thing which I think is, I understand that you wanted to make a correlation between the TV channels which are affiliated with a specific sects in order to study their impact on the level of the sectarianism or polarization or division or whatever you want to call it in the end in that society. But why don't you directly ask them about their political affiliation or use the data that reveals the political affiliation of these people? Or maybe you can develop an index between the political affiliation and the impact. Why? Because from our point of view or from our research, we realize that, for example, the Sunnis, when there is a crisis in Iraq, the Sunnis watch TV channels which associated with the Sunni communities or the Sunni leaders, and they watch maybe for a longer period the TVs which are associated with the Shiites groups, because they wanted to know what the others are preparing for them or they think of them. So I think political affiliation is more important. In 2003, 2004, the American politicians and American scholars and then American politicians in 2003 stated that the anti-American feelings in the region, in the Middle East, is due to the broadcasting of Al Jazeera. We conducted surveys in 2004 and 2005 in 6 or 7 Arab countries, and we asked specifically on this. Of course, we didn't find out that there is anti-American feelings. We found out that there is anti-American foreign policy. Okay, the people are, you know, they are accepting the American values. They value the American way of life. However, there is no correlation between those who are following the news from Al Jazeera and the anti-American foreign policy in the region. They could follow the BBC and still have anti-American foreign policy. The impact of conflict and violence on the life, I think this should be developed into different areas. Maybe it's developed in your research or in your paper, because you will find out, because this is, for example, ISIS conquering Mosul and the liberation of Mosul is a huge thing, and I think they impacted the people at large. I think maybe you should develop different aspects of their life that you need to examine in order to see if these aspects has any type of link to the rise or decline of sectarianism. That's my point of view. I think it's because I think that every individual in the area was impacted. And even if it's not impacted, they can spend hours and hours telling you about the impact or the effect of this conflict on their lives at large. Apart from that, yeah, I think, not because we are at the center, but I think that the Arab Opinion Index has, more questions related to the polarization. Despite the fact that you are working in Iraq, I think it would be very useful to have, even from the Arab Opinion Index, some tables that shows the level of polarization or divisions or how different segments of the society see each other in, for example, Morocco, Tunisia, because that would make sense to measure the level of sectarianism in Iraq, because it's a conflict zone. People are thinking, but if you compare it with countries like Morocco or Algeria, that might be helpful. That might normalize the figures, because sometimes the figures are shocking when it comes, especially figures that works with perceptions, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. I'm looking forward, for your research, because I think that would be very useful for the people who are working on sectarianism, because you will give, evidence from different perspectives on this issue, and that might help us in understanding this phenomenon in better light. Thank you. There is another thing, I wanted to, and I think this is a question maybe you should, why the Kurds in Iraq, a conflict zone, were immune to this Shiites Sunnis division? Yeah, I think they are.
Like between themselves?
Yeah, between themselves, and they didn't feel that they have to side with the Sunnis. There are Shiites and Sunnis on one hand, okay? So there was, you know, they were immune from my point of view. They kept at least, you know, the national identification of themselves, reduced any possible sectarian tension between.
In KRG or the Kurds in other?
In Iraq, I'm talking about Iraq, because there are Shiites and Sunnis among the Kurds.
Yeah, the Shias are a minority though.
But this is one thing. Maybe this would explain. But the second thing, that they didn't feel that they should side with the Sunnis in Iraq. That's what I mean, you know. And I think this is very important, you know. I mean, if you could explore this, because that would show you or put, you know, the entire phenomenon in different perspective. Okay, in the same country, they are influenced by the same factors, and you find one nationality or one nation or one ethnic group is immune of getting involved in this conflict or this sectarian tension. And you know, meeting with the Kurds, I mean, it's like, you know, for them, it's not an issue. It's like they are not Muslims or they are not. Okay, thank you.